In this video, we'll survey a well-known pericope from the Gospels that significantly calls into question the sentiment that the Gospel writers were reliable conveyors of objective history. We'll identify parts of this specific story that betray signs of fabrication, redaction, and confusion on the parts of the Gospel authors that should cause one to wonder whether this is the most contradiction-riddled story in the Gospels. In Mark chapter 14, we're told that 2 days before the Passover, Jesus found himself in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. Then, verses 3 through 9 state the following. As he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." This pericope is what's known as the anointing of Jesus. If we read the parallel account in Matthew chapter 26, we see roughly the same story. In Matthew, just like in Mark, the story takes place in Bethany 2 days before Passover in the house of Simon the leper. The unnamed woman takes a costly alabaster jar of ointment and pours it on Jesus' head. Then multiple individuals who were present, Mark doesn't specify who, but Matthew specifies that it was the disciples. Anyways, multiple individuals who are present become angry and scold the woman due to the fact that the costly jar of ointment is being wasted and could have been sold for money and given to the poor. Jesus rebukes those quarreling and affirms that the woman has done a great service for him and has anointed his body for burial. He also makes a passing remark that, quote, "You always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me," end quote. It appears as if both of these accounts in Mark and Matthew are largely identical. So, what's the issue? This pericope seems rather straightforward and without controversy. Well, it appears that way until we read the parallel account in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. As we read through this version of the story, make sure to note both the similarities and the differences with the accounts in Mark and Matthew. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." Let's note the similarities that John's account has with Mark and Matthew, before we note the major differences. John's account takes place in Bethany, right before Passover. Jesus is sitting at the table, and a woman takes costly perfume made of nard and anoints Jesus with it. At least one person becomes angry, expressing that the perfume should have been sold for money, specifically 300 denarii in lockstep with Mark, and that this money should have been given to the poor. Jesus rebukes the naysayer, mentions the relation of the perfume to his burial, and utters the remark verbatim that, quote, "You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." These similarities alone should alert an attentive reader that in John we're dealing with the same pericope from Mark and Matthew. However, we do have some major differences that also might alert an attentive reader that perhaps instead we're dealing with a completely different story. For in John, the anointing story takes place 6 days before Passover as opposed to the 2 days before that Mark and Matthew relay. And in John, the setting is in a house, but we're not told whose house, and there's absolutely no mention of Simon the leper. In John, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are all explicitly mentioned, whereas in Mark and Matthew, none of these characters are present. In John, we're told the name of the woman who anoints Jesus, Mary, whereas in Mark and Matthew, we're not clued into the identity of the woman, nor is there any indication that this is an individual related to any other narratives in the Gospels, or that Jesus even knows this woman. In John, Mary anoints Jesus' feet and wipes them with her hair, whereas in Mark and Matthew, Jesus' head is anointed. In John, only Judas speaks out against the action, as opposed to multiple disciples and onlookers speaking out in Mark and Matthew. So, what are we to make of all this? Is John attempting to relate the same story as Mark and Matthew? John places his story at a different time, presumably in a different house, and with different people involved in Mark and Matthew relay. Yet John's story follows the exact same structure, with roughly the same actions and character motivations, and even uses the exact phrasing of Mark and Matthew in more than one place in the pericope, including an exact 14-word verbatim string. It would appear then that all three authors are indeed attempting to relay the same story, albeit with one or more authors making certain alterations and redactions. And if you're not convinced by my conviction, then perhaps evangelical New Testament scholar Dr. Craig Blomberg will convince you with his sentiments in The Historical Reliability of John's Gospel, where he states, "The Markan account is almost certainly referring to the same event as John does here. It's unlikely that two separate women would anoint Jesus with identical bottles of costly perfume for the same reason, to anticipate his burial, leading to the same conversation about the poor in the context of a meal with his disciples, all within 5 days of each other. When one looks at the Markan passage, however, several indications suggest that Mark has thematically relocated, and Matthew has simply copied him, what John narrates in its correct chronological sequence." Well, there you have it. Mark, Matthew, and John are all attempting to relay the same story, but one or more authors have deliberately altered and fabricated details. In light of this, either Simon the leper or Lazarus, Mary, and Martha have seemingly been interpolated into the story. The setting and time period appears to have been altered as well. The manner of the anointing of Jesus also has been changed. Those who become angered changes from onlookers and the disciples to Judas alone. This, in and of itself, is enough to begin to entertain doubts regarding exactly how reliable our gospel authors are. And yet, we still have more major issues to uncover. For let us not forget that the gospel author we have yet to mention, Luke, also has a story where Jesus is anointed by a woman in the house of another. Luke's version, found in Luke chapter 7, is 14 verses long, so I won't quote the whole passage. Nevertheless, the important highlights of Luke's anointing story are that Jesus was dining in the house of a Pharisee named Simon. Subsequently, a woman in the city who was a sinner heard where Jesus was and brought an alabaster jar of ointment. She stood behind Jesus at his feet, weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. Then she began kissing his feet and anointing them with the ointment. From this spectacle, Simon the Pharisee makes it clear to Jesus that the woman is a sinner, at which point Jesus tells Simon a parable regarding the cancellation of debt and the forgiveness of sins, and subsequently forgives the sins of the woman anointing him. Again, we have striking similarities between Luke's anointing story and the accounts in Mark, Matthew, and John. We have Jesus dining at someone's house, and just as in Mark and Matthew, the individual is named Simon. We have a woman bringing an alabaster jar of ointment, which is exactly how Mark and Matthew describe the woman's ointment in their accounts. We have this woman wipe Jesus' feet with her hair and anoint his feet with the ointment, as John narrates in his account. Now, yes, there are also major differences between these accounts, much more so than with John's account versus Mark and Matthew's, especially since this pericope doesn't take place anywhere near the time of Passover, nor anywhere near the arrest of Jesus as it does in the other Gospels. And yet, I still find myself echoing the same sentiment of Dr. Blomberg's that we surveyed earlier. It seems unlikely that two separate women would anoint Jesus with identical bottles of ointment in alabaster jars, and both would wipe his feet with their hair and anoint his feet, and have both events taking place at a dinner in the home of a man named Simon. It seems clear, to me at least, that these are two traditions, again, relaying the same story wherein the authors have taken the liberty to alter, fabricate, and interpolate. To survey Dr. Blomberg's Apologetic for the apparent similarities I just highlighted, he states, quote, "It is possible, however, that the two traditions did cross-pollinate each other a little in the oral tradition, leading to certain similarities in form and wording." End quote. I'd argue that the similarities between these two traditions demonstrate that much more than a little cross-pollination has occurred. These, again, are all traditions that follow the same structure, with roughly the same actions and motivations of the characters, and even use exact phrasing and exact character names. There are differences, yes, but we've already seen that between Mark, Matthew, and John, multiple authors have altered details and interpolated characters, so why wouldn't we include Luke in this literary carousel as well? Is it not likely that Luke, just like the other authors, wanted to tell a familiar story, but decided to fabricate and redact certain details in order to frame the story to fit his theological motivations? To argue the contrary in this case would appear to be special pleading, as we've already seen that this did in fact occur between Mark, Matthew, and John. Now, even given all these moving parts that we've surveyed and the issues that exist between them, there are still more problems to contend with. For recall that only John's account of the anointing makes explicit use of the sisters Martha and Mary. Yet we know of Martha and Mary not only from John's Gospel, but from Luke's as well. In fact, in John's Gospel, he presupposes that his readers are familiar with the story of Mary anointing Jesus and wiping his feet with her hair, as he makes a passing remark to this story in chapter 11, before he himself narrates the pericope in chapter 12. Nevertheless, recall that in John, Mary and Martha are from Bethany, a suburb of Jerusalem. However, when Jesus enters the village of Mary and Martha in Luke chapter 10, he does not appear to be in Bethany. In fact, he's nowhere near Bethany or Jerusalem, as the last town mentioned before this pericope is Samaria, approximately 30 miles away from Bethany. And in chapter 13, 3 chapters later, Jesus is still making his way to Jerusalem. And in chapter 17, even though Jesus is still headed to Jerusalem, he remains close to Galilee. The point here is that according to John, Mary and Martha lived in Bethany, but according to Luke, Mary and Martha lived nowhere near Bethany and likely lived closer to Galilee. On its own, this isn't a faith-shattering contradiction, but it's a contradiction nonetheless. And paired with all the other issues we've surveyed, it's one more issue that calls the reliability of the gospel authors into question. Now, at this point, there's two avenues that apologists tend to take in order to deal with the plethora of issues that have been identified with this gospel pericope. The first avenue is that of a Christian fundamentalist who merely affirms the literal truth of how the different gospels present their disparate stories. The fundamentalist will affirm that each of the accounts of Jesus' anointing in Luke, John, and the parallel accounts in Mark and Matthew are unequivocally true, which entails that Jesus was anointed at least 3 separate times, 2 times within only a few days of one another, towards the end of his ministry. And even though all the stories contain a multitude of verbatim similarities, each story represents a completely separate historical event. These fundamentalists are the same individuals who believe that Jesus cleansed the temple twice, merely because John records the event at an earlier time than the synoptics, instead of affirming the much more likely inference that John has merely literarily relocated the event to fit his own ends of storytelling. I won't expend much effort here in arguing against this line of reasoning, as I think the fundamentalist position clearly reflects the efforts of one motivated a priori to uphold the truth and inerrancy of the Gospels as theological texts first, as opposed to one who approaches the Gospels historically a posteriori. Now, the second avenue that one might take is in line with scholars like Dr. Mike Licona and his work on compositional devices, highlighted in his books Jesus Contradicted and Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? According to Dr. Licona, historiography in antiquity, especially Greco-Roman biography, was more fluid and less rigid than modern historiography. Historians and biographers from antiquity felt freer to change the structure, location, sequence, and details of an account in order to frame their storytelling, while still accurately retaining what they took to be the gist or essence of said account. Given this consideration, so the apologist says, it's not at all unexpected that we would find 3 different accounts of the anointing of Jesus that differ in so many details, while simultaneously retaining essentially the same story in each case. While this defense is more respectable and more plausible than the fundamentalist approach, it's not without its issues. Consider that Dr. Licona's term, compositional devices, is really just a euphemism for fact-changing. Altering the location, sequence, and details of an account is altering facts, plain and simple, no matter the motivation on the part of the authors. Once the door is open to fact-altering, fabrication, and redaction, it is not so easily shut, even if one wants to claim that only minor facts were altered or fabricated. Admitting that the gospel authors have changed or manufactured details significantly jeopardizes the reliability of these narratives, even if one wants to find solace in the fact that other ancient historians and biographers employed the same devices. Think about the implications in terms of the gospel account we've been surveying. When did the anointing of Jesus take place? Where did it take place? In whose house? Who anointed Jesus, and was his head or his feet anointed? Who was present? What did they say, and what was their disposition? And how did Jesus react to the situation? Depending on what gospel we read, we get completely different and many times contradictory answers. If Mark and Matthew are right, then John and Luke have altered facts. If John is right, then Mark, Matthew, and Luke have altered facts, etc. We simply don't know who's changed what and to what extent, nor do we know the reasons why. Also, those who would follow this line of reasoning championed by Dr. Licona run into a problem when they claim that despite the many differences in the accounts, the gist or essence of the story remains the same. For how are we to come to an agreement regarding what the gist or essence of a story is? There seems to be no objective standard for such a judgment. Dr. Lydia McGrew, a philosopher and interdisciplinary scholar who's well known for her critiques of Dr. Licona's use of compositional devices, expresses the same sentiment.
But Dr. Licona objects to the terminology on the grounds that allegedly the changes are not essential. What he has said in his recent series of videos is that we should only call it fact-changing if it changes the essence of the story. And if it doesn't change the essence of the story or the essence of Jesus' message or something of that kind, we should not call it fact-changing. This is a fairly subjective standard. Not everyone's going to agree as to what counts as the essence of the story or the essence of the message, and it seems odd that we should have to decide first what's the essence of the story and then decide whether to call something a fact or not.
So, the second avenue that we've surveyed here doesn't seem to absolve the Gospels of the issues we've uncovered. No matter how we slice it, the pericope of the anointing of Jesus is riddled with contradictions. In closing, I want to survey a stunning admission from Dr. Licona in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? Speaking of the author of the Gospel of John, Dr. Licona states that, quote, John often chose to sacrifice accuracy on the ground level of precise reporting, preferring to provide his readers with an accurate, higher-level view of the person and mission of Jesus, end quote. First, this is a stunning admission from a Christian apologist. Just admitting that John often sacrificed accuracy and precise reporting for theological motivations is incredible. But given what we've surveyed, this charge cannot simply apply to John alone. John is not the only gospel author who has sacrificed accuracy and precise ground-level reporting in the pericope of the anointing of Jesus. Many facts have been changed by more than one author, that's for sure. But second, and more importantly, Licona's assertion that John has sacrificed accuracy in order to provide his readers with a more accurate, higher-level view of Jesus is simply a non sequitur. If we know that John has altered ground-level facts to present a specific, higher-level view of Jesus, then how do we know he didn't do the same at this higher level? How do we know that both the ground level and the higher level aren't riddled with fabrications and dubious theological motivations? We don't. And this goes for all the Gospels, not just John. Since the story of the anointing of Jesus casts widespread doubt among the authors when it comes to their ability to relay sober and accurate ground-level history, then it follows that their higher-level portraits of Jesus can be just as suspect. So, what we've seen then is that a simple and well-known pericope in the Gospels regarding the anointing of Jesus is mired in ambiguity and riddled with inconsistencies. We don't know what's authentic and what's been altered and fabricated by the Gospel authors. Was Jesus anointed by a woman at some point in his ministry? Most likely, but every other detail in the stories is up for doubt. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.